The wind had teeth, and it was chewing on the bones of a dying town called Elhorn. It screamed across the frozen plains, piling snow against buildings that hunched over like old men coughing their last breaths into a gray, godless sky. Inside the town's only church, a funeral was ending, but nobody was crying. The woman in the pine box had been a problem, and her daughter, well, the daughter was a ghost they could finally get rid of. Her name was Ruth. She was 5 years old, and she never ever spoke. With hair the color of a burned-out fire and eyes that held the emptiness of the winter sky, she just stood there, silent. Her mother had died of a fever in the back room of the town brothel, a business the preacher himself secretly owned. With no family and no money, the good folks of Elhorn held a quick meeting. Their charity had frozen solid with the ground. "Can't afford another mouth to feed," the butcher grunted, his apron stained with more than just animal blood. "She's touched," the preacher's wife hissed, clutching her pearls. "Cursed, that silence ain't natural." The sheriff, a man named Isaiah Vane, looked at the little girl and saw nothing. Not a child, just a loose end. A piece of a story he wanted buried for good. So they made their decision. They stripped her of the simple dress her mother had made her, leaving her in nothing but a thin shift. They wrapped her in a threadbare blanket, and the preacher tied a small folded note to her tiny wrist. It read, "Unwanted. Let God take her." But there was something else on that note, something hidden in the fold. A small, strange symbol drawn in faded ink. A circle with a broken line through it, a secret mark. They led her to the edge of town, where the last dirt track disappeared into a wilderness of snow and shadows. The first flakes were beginning to fall again, heavy and wet. They left her there, barefoot, alone, and they walked back to their warm homes without a single glance over their shoulders. This wasn't cruelty to them. It was housekeeping. Out here on the frontier, you didn't fix what was broken. You threw it out. Ruth stood motionless, the wind tearing at her blanket. She didn't cry. She didn't shiver. She just looked out toward the woods, where the world was turning a deep, bruised blue in the fading light. Then she took a step. Her bare feet sank into the biting snow, the cold, a shock that went straight to her bones. But she took another step, and another. She walked away from the only home she'd ever known, a place that had only ever offered her silence. The snow sliced at her feet, and soon tiny red blossoms bloomed in her footprints. But she kept moving. Deep down in that silent part of her, a single thought echoed. Stillness is death. Her mother's eyes had gone still. She would not. The forest swallowed her whole. The trees were black skeletons clawed with ice. Crows watched from high branches like feathered judges. The snow got deeper, climbing up her shins. Her breath came in tiny pain clouds. Her hands were turning a dark, waxy purple. Her legs felt like wood. She stumbled, then fell face first into a drift. The blanket, her only protection, was ripped away by the wind and skittered across the snow like a departing spirit. She tried to get up. She couldn't. The world was a white blur, then a gray one, then nothing. Her eyes blinked once, then they closed. And that should have been the end of Ruth, a tiny forgotten footnote in a town full of ugly secrets. But it wasn't, because through the howling wind came a new sound, the steady rhythmic crunch of hooves on snow. A lone rider crested the ridge, a silhouette against the dying light. He was a mountain of a man, hunched in a thick buffalo coat, his hat pulled so low it hid his face. He rode a horse as black as a coffin, and behind him he dragged a sled piled high with firewood. His name was Silas Creed, though he hadn't said that name out loud in 10 years. His face, hidden beneath a wild gray-streaked beard, was a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights. A rifle was slung across his back, a worn Bible was tucked in his saddlebag, and a whole graveyard of ghosts rode in his memory. He saw the small shape in the snow before his horse did. The animal stopped, snorting a plume of hot air. Silas dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes squinting against the swirling flakes. He knelt down. It was a child, a girl, nearly a corpse. He pressed two calloused, frozen fingers to her neck. He waited. Nothing. He waited a second longer. And there it was, a pulse. Thready, weak, a tiny bird fluttering against the cage of her ribs. But it was there. She was alive. As he shifted her, the wind whipped the note tied to her wrist. He caught it. Unwanted. Let God take her. He read the words and his mouth tightened into a grim, bloodless line. Then he unfolded it completely. And he saw it. The hidden symbol. The circle with the broken line. A muscle in his jaw twitched. His eyes, which had been as dead as the winter landscape, suddenly lit with a cold, dangerous fire. He knew that mark. He hadn't seen it in years, not since the night his world burned down, not since the night they took his wife from him. He tore the note from her wrist and shoved it into his pocket. He stripped off his own heavy coat, the one thing keeping him from freezing to death, and wrapped the girl in its thick, warm layers. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. She was so cold her skin felt like stone. As he held her, her eyes fluttered open for just a second. They were dark, empty pools, but in them he saw a reflection of his own haunted past. He turned, leading his horse, and started walking back the way he came, into the heart of the unforgiving woods. He didn't say a word for a long time. Then he spoke to the ghost that always walked with him, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You've got a cruel sense of humor, Lord," he muttered into the wind. He took another 10 paces, the small, cold weight in his arms feeling heavier than all his sins combined. And then he said something strange, something that was part prayer, part promise, part a confession to a memory. "Will you marry me?" The words weren't for the girl. Not really, they were for his wife, for the life he'd lost. But as he spoke them, carrying this strange, silent child who bore the mark of his enemies, something deep inside Silas Creed, something that had been frozen for a decade, finally cracked. He thought he was just saving a child from the snow. He had no idea he was picking up a weapon that, one day, he would aim directly at the heart of the town that had created them both. Silas's camp was a secret whispered between ancient pines and granite boulders. It wasn't a home, it was a hiding place. A simple lean-to against a rock face, a fire pit protected from the worst of the wind, and a constant, vigilant silence. He laid the girl on his own bedroll, a pile of furs that smelled of wood smoke and pine, and covered her with every blanket he owned. He worked with a quiet efficiency, melting snow for water, stoking the fire until it roared, a defiant beast against the encroaching night. He watched her breathe, shallow, ragged little puffs of air. He sat there all night, rifle across his lap, not sleeping, just watching. And the memories he'd spent 10 years trying to outrun finally caught up. He saw the flames licking the walls of his cabin. He heard his wife, Sarah, screaming his name. He felt her hand slipping from his grasp. He smelled the gunpowder and the blood. His blood. Their blood. The men who did it, they wore a mark. A small, crude tattoo on their wrists. A circle with a broken line. They were part of a land-grabbing syndicate, a pack of wolves in men's clothing, led by a ruthless man who bought sheriffs and preachers like cattle. A man who had set up his operation in a backwater town called Elhorn. Silas had hunted them. He'd spent 5 years tracking them down, one by one, leaving a trail of bodies from Kansas to the territories. He'd become a ghost, a legend whispered by campfires. Silas Creed, the man who killed without a word. But he never got the man at the top, the man who gave the orders. He'd gotten close, but the trail went cold right at Elhorn's doorstep. Eventually, the vengeance had burned him out, leaving nothing but ash. He dropped his guns, picked up a Bible he barely understood, and disappeared into the mountains, praying for an end. "Let me save one," he had prayed into the ashes of his life. Just one. And now the Lord, in his infinite and cruel wisdom, had delivered him a child from Elhorn, a child bearing his enemy's mark. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a sign. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a reckoning. The girl didn't speak for 2 days. She was like a wild thing, a small, wounded animal. She drank the broth he made when he held the cup to her lips. She ate the stewed rabbit he prepared. But her eyes followed his every move. They weren't the eyes of a 5-year-old. They were ancient, knowing. They'd seen the worst of the world and had decided it wasn't worth talking to. On the third day, as he reached to give her a cup of water, her small, purpled hand shot out and took it from him. It was the first move she'd made on her own. He raised a single bushy eyebrow. "You got a name, girl?" Silence. Just those dark, watchful eyes. He thought for a moment. He thought of the note, of the town. He thought of his Bible. "Ruth," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "There's a woman in my book named Ruth. A good one. Stayed loyal when nobody else would. How about it?" Ruth. She didn't nod. She didn't object. She just took a slow sip of water. For Silas, that was as good as a yes. He started teaching her. Not how to read or write, but how to live. How to find dry kindling under snow-laden branches. How to set a snare that could catch a rabbit. How to tell the difference between a wolf track and a dog track. She learned without a word, a silent shadow mimicking his every move. She was a natural. The wilderness didn't scare her. It was the world of men that had hurt her. He found himself talking more than he had in years. He'd narrate everything he did, not because he expected an answer, but because her silence seemed to demand it. The emptiness around them felt less crushing when he filled it with his own rough voice. A week later, while he was trying to teach her how to sharpen a skinning knife, she stopped and pointed. A single eagle feather was caught in a low-hanging branch. She reached up, plucked it free, and carefully tucked it behind her ear. It was the first thing he'd ever seen her claim for herself. A month after that, a pine cone fell from a tree and hit him square on the head while he was muttering a half-remembered verse from the Bible to a stump, and for the first time, a sound came from her. Not a word, a laugh, a small, rusty little sound, like a hinge that hadn't been used in years. He rubbed the lump on his head, pretending to be angry. "You mocking the word of the Lord, girl?" She didn't answer, but the corner of her mouth twitched into a tiny secret smile. It was the most beautiful thing Silas had seen in a decade. They spent the rest of the winter like that, a strange, silent girl and a broken man, hidden away from the world. The snow piled high, and the wolves howled their hunger to the moon, but their fire never went out. He taught her how to handle his old rifle, a beast of a weapon that was almost as big as she was. He'd set up a tin can on a log 50 yards away. Her small hands could barely wrap around the stock. Her shoulder was too small to properly brace it. She missed the first 4 times. The kick of the rifle nearly knocked her flat. He didn't say a word, just reloaded and handed it back. On the 5th try, she took a slow breath, just as he'd shown her. She squeezed the trigger. The can flew off the log with a satisfying ping. He didn't praise her. He just took the rifle, reloaded it, and said in his low growl, "Good. Now do it again." And she did. When the first thaws of spring began to turn the snow to slush, she started bringing him things. A strangely shaped rock, a sprig of the first green pine, a handful of stubborn, pale wildflowers. He put the flowers in an old tin cup and set them by the fire. It looked ridiculous, a splash of fragile color in their grim, gray world. He didn't mind, but spring brought more than just wildflowers. It brought the sound of melting rivers, the chirping of birds, and the movement of men. Travelers were on the trails again, and with them came rumors, whispers that traveled from one dusty outpost to the next, whispers about Silas Creed, the vengeful ghost, being seen in the northern mountains. The law, or what passed for it, had a long memory for men like Silas. But he knew this wasn't about the law. The men who wanted him dead didn't wear badges. They were the ones who had paid the law to look the other way. They were the men from Elhorn, the men with the mark of the broken circle. One afternoon, down by the creek where he and Ruth gathered water, he saw it, a boot print in the mud. It wasn't his. It wasn't hers. It was fresh. That night he didn't sleep. He sat by the dying embers of the fire, his rifle across his lap, watching the impenetrable darkness of the woods. Ruth slept peacefully nearby, still wrapped in his old buffalo coat, a habit she'd never broken. It was her armor. He stared into the night, his senses on high alert. He could feel it. They were being watched. The past was no longer a distant shadow. It was here, breathing down his neck. He looked at the sleeping girl, her face soft in the firelight. He had tried to outrun his past, to bury it in snow and scripture. But he saw now that you can't outrun what you are. He whispered to the ghosts in the darkness, a promise to the wife he'd lost and the child he'd found. A man can't escape what he was, he murmured. But maybe he can keep it from swallowing someone else. The next morning broke clear and cold. Ruth was already awake, poking the fire with a stick. Before Silas could even speak, she looked up at him, her dark eyes serious. She didn't say a word. She just pointed one small finger towards the trail leading down the mountain. Silas looked. His blood went cold. Two riders moving slow and deliberate, picking their way up the path toward their camp. They weren't travelers, they were hunters, and he and the girl were the prey. He stood up, his joints cracking. Time to go. They packed in silence, a fluid, practiced routine. He took the food and the bedrolls. Ruth carefully wrapped the old worn Bible in a piece of oilcloth and stowed it in a saddlebag. He kept the rifle in his hands. As he threw the last of their gear onto the horse, she tugged on the sleeve of his shirt. He looked down at her. Her face was calm, but her eyes were burning with an intensity that startled him. For the first time since he'd found her, she spoke to him. Her voice was a cracked, rusty whisper, rough from years of disuse. You meant it? She rasped. He frowned, confused. Meant what, girl? She looked him straight in the eye, her gaze unwavering. That first night, in the snow. She took a breath. Will you marry me? Silas stared at her. The sound of the approaching riders faded into the background. He looked at this fierce, silent child who had somehow brought him back to life. He looked down the trail toward the danger that was coming for them, for a past that refused to stay buried. A slow, dry chuckle escaped his lips, a sound like rocks grinding together. Yeah, Ruth, he said, his eyes narrowing as the sun broke through the trees. Best proposal I ever made. For the first time since he'd known her, a true, genuine smile spread across Ruth's face. It was fierce and beautiful and terrifying all at once. Behind them, their camp disappeared into the trees. Ahead, the road was unknown and dangerous. But for the first time in a very long time, neither of them was riding alone. And the hunt had just begun. Years bled into one another, measured not in seasons, but in miles. They drifted like smoke, from the high mountains to the sun-scorched plains, never staying in one place long enough for roots to take hold. Silas said it was because men with long memories were looking for him. Ruth knew the truth was deeper. They were ghosts, haunting the edges of a world that had no place for them. Ruth grew. The scrawny, half-frozen child disappeared, replaced by a tall, lean girl with whipcord strength and a silence that was now her choice. She moved with the quiet grace of a predator, her eyes missing nothing. She still rarely spoke, but she and Silas had a language that needed no words. A raised eyebrow, a slight nod, the way one of them would shift their weight. It was a conversation as clear as any spoken one. Each night, by the flickering light of their campfire, Silas would talk. He wasn't teaching her anymore. He was arming her. He spoke of the world as he knew it, a place of scars and survival, where justice was something you made for yourself because no one was going to give it to you. People don't change, Ruth, he'd say, staring into the flames. They just get better at hiding the parts of themselves they don't want you to see. Remember that. Trust what a man does, not what he says. She would listen, her hands busy sharpening her knife or cleaning her rifle, absorbing every word. Regret, he told her one night, his voice heavy with the weight of it. It won't fix a damn thing, but sometimes it's the only thing that reminds you that you were once a man and not a monster. One evening, with a thunderstorm grumbling on the horizon, Silas pulled out his cracked leather Bible. He didn't read from it, not in the way a preacher would. He used it like a map to his own broken soul. He traced a passage with a scarred finger. There's a story in here, he said, his voice low, about your namesake, Ruth. She's stuck by an old woman who'd lost everything. Her husband, her sons, her home. Everyone told her to leave, to save herself. But she wouldn't. She said, where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people and your God, my God. She stayed, nailed herself to that old woman's fate. He closed the book, the leather sighing. You remind me of her, girl. Stubborn as a mule and twice as loyal. Ruth didn't reply, but she sat up a little straighter. The name he'd given her had become her own. Their life had a hard rhythm. Mornings were for tracking and hunting. Afternoons were for practice. Ruth could shoot the eye out of a hawk at 100 paces. She could throw a knife with enough force to pin a man's hand to a tree. Silas even taught her how to read the subtle tells in a card game, how to spot a liar by the twitch in his eye. She had her own horse now, a tough little buckskin she called Ghost, and the animal was as fierce and loyal as she was. But the past is patient. It waits. In a dusty, windblown town called Lead Hollow, while Ruth was watering Ghost, she overheard them. Two grizzled, greasy-looking men, their voices low and conspiratorial. Heard that old bastard Silas Creed is still kicking, one of them muttered. The other spat a stream of tobacco juice. Yeah, down south. They say he's traveling with some girl now. Not his kin. Found her in the woods, they say. Don't matter. The bounty's still active. A private one. Paid by some big shot out of Elhorn. The law ain't involved, which means no rules. Ruth froze. Her hand tightened on the rope, and Ghost shifted uneasily beside her, sensing the sudden coldness in her. Bounty, private, Elhorn. The words were like keys, unlocking a door in her mind she hadn't known was there. It wasn't the law hunting them. It was someone specific. Someone from that town. That night, camped in a dry creek bed, she said nothing. But the air between them was thick with unspoken questions. The next morning as they packed up, Silas watched her. She checked the loads in her rifle, then her pistol, her movements crisp and efficient. You heard something in town, Silas stated. It wasn't a question. She just nodded once. He didn't press her for details. He didn't have to. He just looked off towards the horizon, his jaw working silently. They rode all day, the silence heavier than a shroud. They were no longer just drifting. Now they were being hunted, and they both knew it. That evening, as Ruth was oiling her pistol by the fire, she finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind since Lead Hollow, a question she'd been carrying for years. Why? She asked, her voice clear and steady. Why do they want you dead? Silas looked at her. The firelight carved deep lines into his face, each one a story she didn't know. He took a long, slow breath. Because I started something, and I didn't finish it. He finally told her. He told her about Sarah, about their cabin. He told her about the land syndicate and the man who ran it from the shadows of Elhorn. And he told her about the mark, the circle with the broken line, the same mark that had been on the note tied to her wrist. Ruth's blood turned to ice. It wasn't a random mark, it was a brand. It was the signature of the man who had ordered her mother's death and her own abandonment. It was the mark of the man who had destroyed Silas's life. It all connected. It was all one story. Her story. His story. They killed my wife, Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Burned our home to the ground. Because I knew their business, and I wouldn't join them. So I hunted them. Every last man I could find. I didn't wait for a trial. I didn't ask questions. I was judge, jury, and executioner. Ruth didn't flinch. She just stared at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It had always been hers too. She just hadn't known it. I thought revenge would quiet the noise in my head, he said, his voice laced with a bitter sorrow. It didn't. It just made it louder. Is it quiet now? She asked softly. He didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, at the ghosts only he could see. A week later, they reached a small, sun-drenched valley, a hidden sanctuary of buzzing bees and wildflowers. It was the homestead of an old friend of Silas's, a man named Harlan Doles. Harlan was a gnarled ex-scout with a face like a dried apple and a laugh that could scare birds out of trees. Silas Creed, he bellowed, wrapping Silas in a bear hug. Still too damn mean to die, I see. Silas actually smiled, a rare crack thing. Still trying, Harlan. For the first time Ruth could remember, they were in a place that felt safe. She slept in a real bed, though she kept her knife under the pillow out of habit. Harlan was kind to her in his rough, no-nonsense way. He taught her how to tend his beehives and told her stories of the old days. Your old man there, Harlan said to her one evening as they sat on the porch. He's always been the quiet type, but don't mistake quiet for gentle. That man's got a fire in him that could melt steel. You keep an eye on him, girl. He acts like old weathered wood, but he still burns hot. The peace lasted for 3 days. On the evening of the fourth day, trouble came riding in. A lone rider, his horse lathered in sweat, galloped into the yard. He was young, and his eyes were wide with terror. Harlan met him on the porch, his old shotgun held loosely in his hands. Silas was right behind him, and Ruth was a few steps behind Silas, a silent shadow, her hand resting on the butt of her pistol. "They're coming," the rider gasped. "5 of them, hard men, asking for Silas Creed and a girl. They're paying top dollar for information." Silas's face became a stone mask. He exhaled a slow, steady stream of air. "How long?" "An hour, maybe less." The young rider, spooked, turned and fled as fast as he'd come. Silas turned to Ruth. His eyes were cold and clear. "Get your rifle." But Ruth didn't move. For the first time, she challenged him. "We run," she said, her voice low and firm. "No." "Why not? We always run." Silas looked at her, then out at the valley, at this small patch of peace they had found. "Because some things, Ruth, they don't chase. They wait. They circle. And if we run now, we'll never stop. This ends. Here. Tonight." Ruth looked at Silas, at the grim determination in his eyes. She looked at Harlan, who was already checking the loads in his shotgun. She nodded once. Her hands were steady as she loaded her rifle. Harlan handed her a heavy pouch of bullets. "I'll be damned if I let a pack of scum ride onto my land," he growled. They didn't wait at the house. They took up positions in the rocks overlooking the narrow entrance to the valley. The sun bled out behind the mountains, painting the clouds in shades of orange and blood. The world went silent, holding its breath. Then came the sound, the rhythmic beat of hooves. 5 riders, just as the boy had said. They rode with a confident arrogance, their weapons held ready. The leader, a man with a scarred face, called out into the dusk. "Silas Creed, we know you're in there. Come on out, and we'll make this clean." From behind a massive boulder, Silas stood up, a towering silhouette against the twilight sky. "The only clean thing about you boys," his voice boomed across the valley, "is the spot you'll leave when you're gone." The air exploded. The leader went for his gun, but he was too slow. A shot rang out from Ruth's position. The man was thrown from his saddle, a neat dark hole appearing in his chest. She didn't blink. The recoil kicked her shoulder, but she had already chambered another round, her eyes scanning for the next target. Harlan let out a wild whoop and unleashed a spray of buckshot that took another rider out of his saddle. Silas was moving with a speed that defied his age, a cold, methodical angel of death. Each shot was deliberate. Each one found its mark. The ambush was brutal and swift. 3 men were down. A 4th tried to turn his horse and run, but a bullet from Silas's rifle caught him in the spine. He fell and didn't move. The last man, the youngest of the group, dropped his gun and threw his hands up, his face pale with terror. Blood trickled from a graze on his cheek. Ruth emerged from the rocks, her rifle trained squarely on his heart. "Please," the man stammered, his eyes wide. I didn't know. They just said it was a bounty. Good pay." Ruth stepped closer, her face unreadable. And as she came into the faint moonlight, the man's expression changed. The fear was replaced by a shocking, dawning recognition. "You," he breathed, his voice a horrified whisper. "I remember you. The orphan girl. From Elhorn. From the snow." Ruth froze. The rifle in her hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Silas's voice cut through the ringing in her ears, sharp and cold. "Who are you?" The man let out a strangled, pained laugh. "I was one of them. One of the men who left her there. The sheriff. Vane. He paid us a few dollars to get rid of the problem. We all thought she'd be dead in an hour." His eyes locked on Ruth's. "I guess hell did freeze over." The memories buried for so long came rushing back. This man's face, younger then, laughing. Laughing as they tore the blanket from her. Laughing as they left her barefoot in the snow. "I was just a kid myself," he pleaded, desperation in his voice. I was drunk. Stupid. It was a long time ago. The trigger was cold under her finger. The silence inside her was screaming. All the pain, all the cold, all the years of running. It all coalesced into a single point of burning hatred aimed at this man. Silas stepped between them, blocking her shot. No, Ruth. Her voice was a low, dangerous growl. Move, Silas. He didn't. He stood his ground, a granite wall between her and her past. You pull that trigger, he said, his voice calm and steady, and you'll carry his ghost for the rest of your life, just like I carry mine. You'll become one of them. Her vision blurred. The snow, the wind, the cold, the silence of the town. It was all here right now, choking her. I want it to stop, she whispered, her voice breaking. I just want the noise to stop. It doesn't, Silas said softly. It never does. But you get to decide if you feed the monster or if you starve it. She stared at him, at the deep sadness in his eyes. She saw her own pain reflected there. With a shuddering breath, she slowly, deliberately lowered the rifle. The man didn't wait. He scrambled to his feet and ran, disappearing into the darkness like the coward he was. Later that night, long after Harlan had gone to bed, Ruth sat by the fire, staring into the flames, her rifle across her lap. Silas sat with her, the silence comfortable between them. He handed her a steaming cup of coffee. You did the right thing, Ruth. I wanted him dead, she said, her voice flat. I know. I still want him dead. Silas nodded slowly. You probably always will, and that's all right. But you didn't become him tonight, and that's what matters. He poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. They didn't just leave you in the snow, did they? Sheriff Vane paid them. Your mother, her fever. Ruth looked up, her knuckles white on the coffee cup. It wasn't a fever, she finished for him, the terrible truth settling in her soul like a shard of ice. It was murder, and I was the witness they tried to erase. Silas stared into the fire. So, what now? Ruth looked up, her eyes no longer the eyes of a girl, but of a woman who had just been handed a declaration of war. Her gaze was fixed on the dark northern horizon, in the direction of a town called Elhorn. Now, she said, her voice as cold and hard as frozen steel. We stop running. Now we go back. We don't just bury the dead, Silas. We dig up the truth. The trail to Elhorn wasn't on any map. It was a scar on the land, a path worn by ghosts and bad memories. It wound through skeletal hills and dry gulches, a place where the sun seemed hesitant to shine, and the wind whispered names of the forgotten. For Silas Creed, every hoofbeat was an echo from a past he thought he'd buried. For Ruth, it was a pilgrimage into the heart of her own pain. She rode slightly ahead of him, her back straight, her jaw set like granite. She hadn't spoken more than a few words in the 3 days it took them to get here. There was nothing left to say. They both knew what this was. Not just a reckoning, it was an excavation. They were here to dig up the bones of a conspiracy, and they didn't care who got buried in the process. The rumors they'd heard in the last town painted a clear picture. Elhorn was no longer a dying husk. It was thriving. Sheriff Isaiah Vane was a powerful man now, his pockets lined with money from railroad developers who saw the frontier not as a home, but as a commodity. The preacher Marcus Uhl, the man who had owned the brothel where her mother died, now delivered sermons from a brand new white chapel, his hands washed clean with dirty money. And the saloon, her mother's last known address, was bigger and louder, a monument to the town's calculated amnesia. But they hadn't forgotten her. Oh no, the story of the orphan girl who walked out of the snow, the girl traveling with the infamous Silas Creed, had trickled back. They knew she was coming. They'll be waiting for us, Silas had said the night before, as they made their camp in the shadow of the hills overlooking the town. Good, was all she'd replied, her eyes fixed on the distant lights of Elhorn, burning like angry embers in the dark. He watched her now, cleaning her rifle with meticulous, practiced motions. I ain't here to talk you out of this, Ruth. You know that. She paused, looking up at him, her face illuminated by the flickering campfire. But I need to ask you, he continued, his voice low and serious. When this is done, When you get what you came for, what then? Does it finally end? Or does it just make you into something that can never stop walking? He poked the fire, his face a mask of old sorrows. I carried my hate for so long, it became a part of me. I thought if I just kept killing, eventually the pain would die too. But it doesn't work that way, girl. Hate is a fire that consumes the person holding it. She finished cleaning her rifle, wrapped it carefully in its cloth, and laid it beside her bedroll. I'm not like you, Silas, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I'm not here to kill my pain. I'm here to make sure the people who caused it can't live peacefully with theirs anymore. The next morning they rode into Elhorn. The town had a new face. Fresh paint on the false front buildings, wide new boardwalks, a telegraph wire humming overhead like a promise and a threat. But beneath the paint, it was the same rotten wood. The air still smelled of fear and secrets. And the people still knew how to look right through you, how to see nothing, say nothing. They dismounted in front of the saloon. The sign above the swinging doors now read, "The Gilded Cage." Silas stood with the horses, his hand resting on the stock of his shotgun, a silent, grim sentinel. Ruth walked up the steps alone. Her boots on the wooden boards sounded like hammer blows in the quiet morning air. She pushed through the doors. The place smelled of stale beer and desperation. A few men at the bar turned to look at her. They saw a tall, slender woman in dusty trail clothes. They didn't recognize her, not at first. But the barkeep did. His hand, halfway through pouring a whiskey, began to shake. The glass slipped, shattering on the floor. A name escaped his lips, a choked, terrified whisper. Ruth. The whole saloon went quiet. She walked to the bar and took a seat, her movements calm and deliberate. She looked at the barkeep, whose face had gone as white as a sheet. Daniel McGrath, she said, her voice level. Is he still alive? The barkeep could only nod, his eyes wide with fear. Is he here? A door at the top of the stairs creaked open. Heavy footsteps descended. Daniel McGrath had gotten fat. Fat on profits and power. His hair was streaked with gray. His fingers were heavy with gaudy rings. But his eyes were the same. The same cold, calculating eyes that had watched her being stripped of her clothes and cast out into the snow. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, a smug smirk playing on his lips. Well, I'll be damned. The little ghost has come back to haunt us. You're already damned, McGrath, she said without looking at him. I'm just here to deliver the message. He chuckled, a nasty, wet sound, and walked toward her, circling like a vulture. What do you want? Money? An apology? Came back to beg? No, she said, finally turning to face him. I came back so you would remember my face. I want you to see it every time you close your eyes. I want it to be the last thing you see when you die. His smirk vanished. His hand darted toward the fancy revolver on his hip. He never had a chance. In a blur of motion, Ruth's own pistol was in her hand, cocked and aimed directly at his bloated gut. At the same instant, the saloon doors swung open and Silas stepped inside, the twin barrels of his shotgun aimed at the other men in the room. I'd strongly advise everyone in here, Silas said, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards, to take a sudden interest in their drinks. McGrath froze, his hand hovering over his gun. So this is about blood, he sneered. No, Ruth said, her voice dropping to a whisper. This isn't about blood. This is about debt. And you, McGrath, are long overdue. He made his move. It was stupid, desperate. He lunged, not for his gun, but for her, his hands reaching for her throat. She sidestepped with the grace of a dancer, brought the butt of her pistol up in a vicious arc, and smashed it into his jaw. There was a sickening crunch of bone. He staggered backward, blood and broken teeth spewing from his mouth, and collapsed to the floor in a groaning heap. The other men in the saloon started to draw their weapons. Try it, Silas said, his voice dangerously calm. Please, make my day. No one moved. Ruth looked down at the whimpering man on the floor. Tell Sheriff Vane, she said, her voice ringing through the silent saloon, that I'm coming for him next. They walked out, leaving a room full of petrified men and one broken brothel owner. Their next stop was the new white chapel at the end of the street. The preacher, Marcus Uhl, was standing in the doorway, clutching his Bible like a shield. He pretended not to know who she was, but the lie was plain in his terrified eyes. "You are not welcome in the house of the Lord," he said, his voice trembling with false piety. "Neither was my mother," Ruth shot back. "But that didn't stop you from taking her money, did it?" He held the Bible up higher. "She was a sinner, and you were born of that sin." "She died in a back room of a brothel you owned," Ruth said, her voice cold as a grave. "You took her last dollar, then you threw her in an unmarked ditch. You want to talk about sin, preacher?" Silas stepped up beside her. "You spoke the words over her grave," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "You blessed the very sin you profited from." The preacher tried to slam the heavy oak door shut. Ruth kicked it open. The crack of the wood echoed like a gunshot down the empty street. She stepped forward until she was inches from his face. "You left me in the snow," she snarled, "with a note that said, 'Let God take her.' But God didn't show up that day, preacher. A man did. And now you're going to answer to me." She pointed toward the cemetery on the edge of town. "You are going to walk over there. You are going to dig my mother up. You are going to give her a proper coffin and a proper grave inside the fence. And then you are going to carve a headstone with her name on it. Her real name, not just sinner." "You can't make me," he sputtered. "You have no right." "I have this," Ruth said, pulling her pistol from its holster. "And in this town, that's all the right I need." The preacher looked from the gun to Silas's cold, dead eyes, and he crumbled. The next morning, the whole town watched in stunned silence as Preacher Ule and two hired men erected a simple but dignified headstone just inside the cemetery gates. Ruth carved the letters herself. Leila, a mother, not forgotten. Beneath it, she added two more words, not forgiven. That left one man, Sheriff Isaiah Vane. They found him in his office behind a large polished desk, a symbol of his ill-gotten authority. He was calmly reading a newspaper and didn't even look up when they walked in. "I was wondering when the frost-bitten ghost would finally show her face," he said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Get up, Vane," Ruth said. He slowly, deliberately folded his newspaper and placed it on the desk. He rose to his feet. He was older, softer, but his eyes held the same arrogant cruelty. My, Ruth, you've certainly grown." Silas took a step forward. "Choose your next words very, very carefully, Sheriff." Vane's smile thinned. "So what's the end game here? A public apology? Or is this the part where you shoot an officer of the law and become a legend?" "I want you to admit what you did," Ruth said. "Which part?" "I've done so many things to improve this town. You knew what they were planning for me. You paid them to do it. You let a child freeze to death to cover up a murder. Your murder." He shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture. "I enforce the law. Sometimes that requires making difficult decisions for the greater good." "You don't enforce the law," she spat. "You enforce silence. You buried my mother and tried to bury me because she knew your secret. She knew you were the head of the syndicate. She knew you were the man Silas was hunting." Vane's face finally lost its composure. The mask slipped. For a second, she saw the real man underneath. A weak, frightened man who had built a kingdom on the bones of his victims. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and his hand moved, reaching for something hidden beneath his desk. A gunshot deafened the room. The bullet from Ruth's pistol shattered the corner of the oak desk, sending splinters flying, missing his hand by less than an inch. He froze, his hand suspended in midair. Silas leveled his shotgun. "Let's finish this outside, Sheriff, in front of your town." The main street of Elhorn was silent. The entire town had come out of their homes and businesses, watching from porches and behind curtains. They watched as Ruth and Silas marched their powerful sheriff into the middle of the street. They remembered the girl. They remembered the storm. And now, finally, they were remembering the debt. Ruth stood 10 paces from him, her rifle held steady. He spit on the ground at her feet. "You won't do it. You came back for justice, not blood. You don't have it in you." "You're right," she said, and her words stunned him into silence. "You gave me neither justice nor mercy, so I won't give you the mercy of a quick death." She looked at him, at the fear now blooming in his eyes. You didn't keep order, Vane. You kept power. You kept your comfort. You let a 5-year-old girl freeze to death because it was easier than being a man. She raised her rifle, not at his heart, but at his chest. She fired. The bullet tore through his fancy vest, ripping the shiny silver badge from it and sending it clattering into the dust. You're done here, she said. Silas stepped forward. You'll ride east. You won't look back. If we ever see your face again, no badge in the world will save you. Vane looked from Ruth's cold, determined face to Silas's promise of death, and something inside him broke. Without a word, he turned, stumbled to his horse, and rode away, a disgraced man with nothing left but the clothes on his back. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of fear or cowardice that had plagued Elhorn for so long. It was the silence of awe. Ruth turned to face the watching townspeople. Her voice, clear and strong, carried across the street. I am not your orphan, she declared. I am not your mistake. I am the ghost you created, and I survived. No one said a word. They didn't need to. The truth was finally out, burning in the clean, cold air. That night, Ruth stood by her mother's new grave. The stars overhead were like chips of ice in a black sky. Silas came and stood beside her. You finished it, he said quietly. No, she replied, a strange sense of peace settling over her. I just started it right. And as if on cue in the deep, quiet dark, the first flakes of snow began to fall. Soft, slow, and for the first time in her life, harmless. The wind that swept down from the hills no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a cleansing breath, sweeping away the last vestiges of Elhorn's poison. Ruth stood at the edge of the southern trail, the town a hollowed-out memory at her back. She didn't look at it. There was nothing left to see. Silas walked up slowly from the cemetery, his hat in his hand. The last few days had taken their toll. The fight, the tension, the ghosts, it had all settled into his bones, making him seem older, more fragile than he was. You sure about this? He asked, his eyes scanning the endless horizon ahead of them. She nodded. There's nothing for us here. He studied her face, the face he'd watched transform from a blank, silent mask into this, a woman carved from resilience and fire. The haunted look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a steady, unwavering purpose. We ride east for a while, she said, her gaze fixed on the trail ahead. Then south, way south. South? He asked, a hint of surprise in his voice. I heard of a place, she said, down near the canyons. A place where people go when they've got nowhere else to go. A place for the broken ones, the outcasts. They say a person can start over there. No questions asked. A small, determined smile touched her lips. I think I'm going to build something, Silas. A place for people who never got a second chance. He looked at her, and a slow, proud smile spread across his own weathered face. Well now, he said, his voice a low rumble. That sounds like exactly the right kind of trouble. They mounted their horses and rode side by side out of the pass, the town of Elhorn shrinking behind them until it was nothing more than a bad dream. For the first time, the road ahead felt like a choice, not an escape. But peace in the West is a fickle thing. It's a skittish horse, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. By midday, that feeling of calm had begun to fray. Ghost Ruth's buckskin became nervous, his ears twitching, his head held high. Silas's horse stomped and snorted, sensing something on the wind. Then they heard it. Not thunder from the sky, the thunder of hooves. 4 riders burst from a copse of trees ahead, blocking the trail. They were armed, their faces grim and set, and the man in the lead wore a sheriff's badge. But this one was real. It gleamed with the authority of the U.S. Marshals. Ruth and Silas pulled up, their hands instinctively going to their weapons. Silas Creed, the marshal said, his voice flat and official. You're under arrest. Ruth's heart sank. She looked at Silas. The old man just sighed, a long, weary sound of resignation. Figured the real law would catch up to me sooner or later. The marshal continued, his eyes hard. Warrants out of 3 territories: murder, robbery, vigilantism. And now we've got a report that you and this woman assaulted a duly appointed sheriff back in Elhorn. He wasn't much of a sheriff, Ruth said, her voice like ice. And we didn't assault him. We gave him his retirement. We're not here for you, miss, the marshal said, his gaze unwavering. Our business is with him. Stand aside. She ain't moving, Silas said, his voice the low growl of a cornered wolf. And neither am I. The air grew thick and heavy. It was a classic standoff. 4 lawmen against an old killer and a girl forged in winter. Ruth's mind raced. Silas never looked at her, but she knew what he was thinking. This was the end of the line. Last chance, Creed, the marshal said. Don't make this a bloodbath. Silas turned his head and looked at Ruth. He gave her a small, quiet smile. It wasn't sad. It wasn't proud. It was just accepting. This isn't your fight anymore, Ruth, he said softly, his voice for her alone. Her grip on her rifle tightened until her knuckles were white. The hell it isn't. You made it mine. He gave the faintest shake of his head. A look of profound peace settled over his features. I made my peace with who I was a long time ago. My bills come due. But you've got a lifetime ahead of you. You go build that place you were talking about. Don't you spend another minute of your life digging graves for broken old men like me. You taught me that revenge turns everything to ash, she said, her voice cracking. Letting them take you, that's just another kind of ash. A single shot exploded, shattering the tense silence. It didn't come from the marshals. It didn't come from Ruth. Silas jerked violently in his saddle, a dark stain blossoming on his shoulder. His rifle clattered to the ground. He swayed, then fell from his horse, crumpling into the dust. Ruth screamed a raw, animal sound of pure rage and grief. Without thinking, she raised her rifle and fired. The man who had shot Silas, not a lawman, but a fifth rider, hidden in the trees, a hired gun sent by the exiled Vane, slumped from his hiding place, dead before he hit the ground. The world erupted into chaos. The marshals, thinking they were being fired upon, returned fire. Bullets ripped through the air, splintering trees and kicking up plumes of dirt. Ruth dove from her horse, scrambling behind a large boulder, her heart pounding against her ribs. Silas was crawling, dragging his shattered body toward cover, his face a mask of agony. Ruth, operating on pure instinct, fired 2 more shots over the rock. One grazed a marshal's cheek. The other slammed into another man's leg, sending him to the ground with a cry of pain. The remaining 2 lawmen hesitated, their confidence shattered. "Drop your weapons!" Ruth screamed, her voice raw with fury. "It was a trap. We were set up." One of the marshals, the leader, saw the 5th man dead in the trees. He saw the look on Ruth's face, and he understood. "Hold your fire!" he bellowed. Ruth lowered her rifle and scrambled to Silas's side. He was lying in the dust, the earth around him stained dark with his blood. "You stupid, stubborn old man," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she tried to staunch the bleeding. "You shouldn't have done that." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and a trickle of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Don't." "Lecture me now, girl," he rasped, a faint, pained smile on his lips. "Let a man die in his own terms." "You're not dying," she said, her voice choked with a sob. "Then what's all this damn blood for?" He wheezed, his attempt at a chuckle turning into another cough. He looked up at her, his eyes starting to glaze over, but filled with a fierce, burning love. "I prayed once to save just one soul. Looks like I finally did." "Don't you dare leave me," she pleaded, her voice breaking completely. "You don't get to leave me." His eyes were soft, his breathing shallow. "Always thought redemption was something you had to earn with pain, but the truth is, you just have to give more than you take." His gaze held hers. "You gave me a reason again, Ruth. You gave me back my soul." With his last ounce of strength, he reached inside his bloody coat. He pulled out the old worn Bible and pressed it into her hand. "The book," he whispered, his voice fading. "You speak better than I ever did. When the time comes, you say the words for the ones no one else will." "I don't want the book," she cried. "I want you." "You've got the fire," he breathed, his hand falling from hers. "This will just help you. Keep it lit." His eyes closed. His last breath escaped him in a soft, quiet sigh. And then he was gone. Silas Creed, the ghost, the killer, the father she never had, was still. The surviving marshals stood in stunned silence. The wind whispered through the pines. The world had gone quiet again. She buried him at the foot of a tall red cliff, overlooking the canyons to the south. She carved his name into the stone herself with her knife. She spoke no prayer. She just stood there for a long time, wearing his heavy buffalo coat over her shoulders, feeling the weight of it, the warmth of it. She tucked his Bible inside, close to her heart. Months later, a rumor started to spread through the territories. A whisper of a place being built out in the Badlands. A sanctuary with no name, run by a quiet woman with eyes that had seen too much. A woman who wore an old oversized buffalo coat and carried a rifle like it was a part of her. They said she offered food, shelter, and a second chance to the outcasts, the drifters, the people the world had thrown away. She never asked them about their pasts. She only asked them what they wanted to build for their futures. Sometimes, at dusk, she would stand alone at the edge of the canyon, the wind whipping her hair, and light a single lantern. She'd place it in the window of the main cabin, its light facing north, a beacon. Some said it was for lost travelers, but those who knew her story knew the truth. It was for the man who had found a lost girl in the snow. Once a year, she would ride north. She never went back into Elhorn, but she would ride past the town to the cemetery on the hill. She'd nod at the two headstones there, one for her mother, one for her own past. And at the foot of her mother's grave, she would leave a single, polished bullet, a payment, a promise, a reminder that some debts are never truly paid. People stopped whispering her name in fear. They started speaking it with a kind of reverence. Ruth Creed, the girl who walked out of the snow and built a home for the homeless. Not a saint, not a sinner. Something else, something more, something earned. And in every fire she lit, in every soul she saved, in every lesson she taught, there lived the ghost of a man who gave her his coat, his name, and a reason to live. If this story taught you anything about justice, revenge, or the power of a second chance, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories that dig up the bones of the past, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Some stories begin in silence, but they only truly live when we remember to share them.